My name is Marcus Sullivan, and at 64 years old, I never imagined I'd be driving strangers around Chicago at 2 in the morning, counting every dollar like my life depended on it. Because it did. The steering wheel of my 2011 Honda Accord had become more familiar to me than my own bed, its worn leather grooves shaped perfectly to fit my calloused hands. The dashboard clock glowed red in the darkness, marking another sleepless night in what felt like an endless string of them. The city looked different at this hour. Lakeshore Drive stretched before me like a ribbon of light, but even the beauty of Chicago's skyline couldn't lift the weight that had settled on my chest months ago. Every building reminded me of dreams I'd abandoned, every street corner of the man I used to be. I was a successful contractor once, with a crew of 12 guys who looked up to me, who trusted me to make the right calls. Now, I couldn't even trust myself to make rent. If you believe that miracles still happen, or if you've ever experienced something that deeply touched your faith, share your story in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so we can continue walking this journey of faith together. The bankruptcy papers were folded neatly in my glove compartment, waiting for me to find the courage to file them. 37 years of marriage, and I couldn't even look Sarah in the eye anymore. She didn't know about the second mortgage I'd taken out to save the business. She didn't know about the credit cards maxed out trying to pay my crew when clients stopped paying their invoices. She didn't know that in 3 weeks, we'd lose the house we'd raised our kids in. My phone buzzed against the cup holder, the rideshare app notification cutting through my thoughts like a knife. A pickup request from Millennium Park. At this hour, it would probably be someone stumbling out of a bar, reeking of regret and bad decisions. I accepted the ride anyway. In this business, you didn't have the luxury of being choosy. The streets were wet from an earlier rain, and my tires made a soft hissing sound as I navigated through downtown. The reflections of streetlights created patterns on my windshield that reminded me of stained glass windows. Funny how your mind goes to church when everything else is falling apart. I hadn't been to Mass in months, not since Father Mackenzie asked me how things were going, and I found myself lying to a priest. As I pulled up to the designated spot near the park, I saw him, a man in his 30s, maybe early 40s, wearing a simple grey coat that looked expensive but not flashy. He approached the car with an unhurried gait, as if he had all the time in the world. Most passengers were in a hurry at this hour, eager to get home or to their next destination. This one moved like he was taking a leisurely stroll through a garden. He slid into the back seat without saying hello, which wasn't unusual. Night riders often preferred silence, but there was something about his presence that filled the car immediately, like the way the air changes before a thunderstorm. I glanced in the rearview mirror, trying to catch his eyes, but he was looking out the window at the park's dark trees. "Where to?" I asked, my voice rougher than I'd intended. He was quiet for a moment, still gazing out at the darkness. "I think you know where we need to go, Marcus." My hands tightened on the steering wheel. I hadn't told him my name. The app only showed drivers' first names to passengers, but even then, I went by Mark on the platform. My full name was listed nowhere he could have seen it. A cold sweat began to form at the base of my neck. "I'm sorry. Do we know each other?" I managed to ask, my voice barely steady. "We're getting to know each other," he said softly. "Start driving west. I'll tell you where to turn." Something in his tone made arguing seem impossible. I put the car in drive and pulled away from the curb, my mind racing through possibilities. Maybe he was someone from the old neighborhood, someone whose face I'd forgotten, but who remembered mine. Chicago was big, but sometimes it felt like the smallest town in the world. As we drove, the familiar sounds of the city at night surrounded us. The distant rumble of the L train, the whistle of wind between buildings, the occasional siren painting red and blue streaks across the wet asphalt. But inside the car, there was a quality of silence I'd never experienced with a passenger. It wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it was profound, like the quiet in a cathedral. "Take a left on Western," he said when we reached the intersection. I followed his directions, heading into a part of the city I didn't often visit. The neighborhoods here were older, filled with small houses and corner stores that had been serving the same families for generations. Streetlights were fewer, creating pools of light separated by stretches of darkness. It felt like driving through someone else's memories. "You're wondering how I knew your name," he said, not looking at me, but somehow knowing exactly what was going through my mind. The thought had crossed my mind, I admitted. "Names are important, Marcus. They carry weight. Your father chose that name for you because it meant warlike in Latin. He wanted you to be a fighter." My blood turned to ice water. My father had been dead for 15 years, and I'd never told anyone the story about my name. He'd explained it to me when I was 7 years old, sitting in his workshop behind our old house on the south side. He'd said life was going to try to knock me down, and he wanted me to have a name that would remind me to get back up. I cleared my throat, trying to maintain some semblance of control. "Lucky guess, Marcus is a pretty common name." "Your father also told you that the strongest steel comes from the hottest fire," the passenger continued, his voice gentle but unwavering. "He said it the day you graduated high school, when you were afraid you weren't smart enough for college." My vision blurred, and I had to blink several times to see the road clearly. That conversation had taken place in the front seat of Dad's old Buick, just the two of us, waiting for Mom to come out of the grocery store. I'd been accepted to community college, but was terrified I'd fail. Dad had put his hand on my shoulder and spoke those exact words. "Who are you?" I whispered. "Keep driving, Marcus. Take the next right." The neighborhood grew quieter as we turned onto a residential street lined with modest houses. Their windows dark except for the occasional glow of a television or porch light. My passenger's presence seemed to expand in the silence, filling every corner of the car with an energy I couldn't name. My hands were trembling now, and I gripped the steering wheel tighter to hide it. "Pull over here," he said, pointing to a spot beside a small park I'd never noticed before, despite driving these streets for months. I parked the car, but kept the engine running, afraid that if I turned it off, I might never start it again. The digital clock on the dashboard read 2:47 a.m., but time felt suspended, like we were existing in a bubble separate from the rest of the world. "You haven't been sleeping," he said. Not a question, but a statement of fact. "Hard to sleep when your world's falling apart," I replied, surprised at my own honesty. Something about this man made pretending seem pointless. "Tell me about the night you made the decision." "What decision?" But even as I asked, I knew what he meant. "The night you decided to take out the second mortgage. 3 months ago. You sat in your kitchen until dawn, looking at the papers, knowing Sarah was asleep upstairs, trusting you to keep her safe." My chest tightened. That night was burned into my memory like a brand. I'd received 3 more calls from clients who couldn't pay their invoices, and I had payroll due the next day. 12 families depending on me, and I couldn't let them down. The house had enough equity, and I'd convinced myself I could make it work, that the contracts would come through, that everything would turn around. How could you possibly know that?" My voice cracked on the last word. "You made coffee at 3:15 a.m. because your hands needed something to do. You used the blue mug Sarah gave you for your 20th anniversary, the one with the chip on the handle that you never wanted to throw away." I stared at him in the rearview mirror, my reflection pale and ghostly in the dim light. The blue mug sat in our kitchen cabinet. And yes, it had a chip on the handle from when our son Tommy had knocked it off the counter when he was 6. Sarah had wanted to replace it, but I'd kept it because Tommy had cried for an hour, thinking he'd ruined something precious. "You're scaring me," I said. "Fear isn't what you should be feeling right now, Marcus." "Then what should I be feeling?" He was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence, I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and irregular. The streetlight above us flickered, casting moving shadows across the car's interior. "Hope?" he said finally. I laughed. but it came out bitter and broken. Hope? I'm about to lose everything I've spent 40 years building. My wife is going to find out I've been lying to her for months. My crew is going to find out their boss is a fraud. Hope is a luxury I can't afford. Can you afford despair? The question hit me like a physical blow. I thought about the nights I'd sat in this car, calculating and recalculating, trying to find a mathematical solution to an impossible problem. I thought about the mornings I'd pretended to go to work sites that no longer existed, driving around aimlessly until Sarah left for her job at the library. I thought about the sleeping pills I'd started taking, not to sleep, but to quiet the voice in my head that whispered increasingly dark suggestions. Last Tuesday, he said, reading my thoughts again, you drove to the Montrose Harbour. You sat there for 2 hours, watching the waves. My blood ran cold. I had gone to the harbour, but I'd told no one. I'd sat on a bench, watching Lake Michigan stretch toward the horizon, thinking about how peaceful it looked, how easy it would be to just walk into the water and let the weight of my failures pull me down. The life insurance would take care of Sarah, at least for a while. Gee, but you didn't go in, he continued. You sat there until the sun came up, and then you came back to drive another shift. Why? I asked, my voice barely audible. Why are you telling me this? What do you want from me? I want you to remember something your father told you about foundations. Another memory surfaced, crystal clear. I was 16, helping Dad lay the foundation for an addition to our house. I'd been impatient, wanting to rush to the fun part, the part where you could see the walls going up. Dad had made me re-level the same section 3 times until it was perfect. A building is only as strong as what it stands on, I whispered, reciting his words. And what is your foundation, Marcus? I thought about it, really thought about it. For years, I'd believed my foundation was my business, my reputation, my ability to provide. But those things had crumbled, and somehow I was still here, still breathing, still capable of love, even if I'd forgotten how to show it. Sarah, I said, my kids, the people I care about, those foundations are still solid, but I've let them down. Have you? Or have you let yourself down and assumed they would feel the same way? The question hung in the air between us. I realized I'd never actually told Sarah what was happening. I'd been so consumed with shame, so terrified of disappointing her, that I'd chosen to lie instead of trust her with the truth. I'd been protecting her from a burden she'd never asked to avoid. Turn left at the next corner, he said. I followed his directions, driving deeper into the residential maze. The houses here were older, some dating back to the early 1900s, with wide porches and mature trees that formed a canopy over the streets. It was the kind of neighborhood where people knew their neighbors' names, where children played in front yards, while their parents watched from kitchen windows. Stop here, he said. We were in front of a small white house with green shutters. The yard was neat, with flower beds that someone had carefully tended, even as winter approached. A single light burned in the front window, warm and inviting. Mrs. Chen lives here, he said. She's been awake since midnight, praying. Praying for what? For you. I stared at the house, confusion mixing with the fear that had become my constant companion. I don't know any Mrs. Chen. She knows you. 3 years ago, you repaired her roof after the storm. She couldn't afford to pay you right away, and you told her not to worry about it, that she could pay when she was able. I remembered the job. A tiny woman in her 70s, recently widowed, living alone in this house that was too big for her but full of memories she couldn't bear to leave. The roof damage hadn't been extensive, but water was getting into her bedroom, and she'd been sleeping on the couch. I'd fixed it the same day, and she'd tried to pay me with a plate of homemade cookies because it was all she had. She paid you 6 months later, every penny with interest, he continued. But she never forgot what you did. She's been praying for you every night since then, asking for blessings on the man who showed her kindness when she needed it most. Tears began to blur my vision. Mrs. Chen had paid me, eventually, but I'd forgotten about the job completely. It was just something you did, the way Dad had raised me. You helped people when they needed help. She doesn't even know I'm in trouble, I said. Doesn't she? Hearts recognize distress? Marcus, kindness creates connections that distance and time cannot break. As if summoned by his words, the front door of the house opened, and a small figure appeared in the doorway. Mrs. Chen stepped onto her porch, wrapped in a thick robe, and looked directly at our car. She raised her hand in a small wave, as if she'd been expecting to see me. She can't possibly see me in this car, in the dark. Some things don't require physical sight. Mrs. Chen went back inside, but the warm glow from her window seemed brighter now, like a beacon in the darkness. "Drive to the end of this street and turn right," my passenger said. As we drove away, I found myself thinking about all the jobs I'd done over the years, all the people I'd helped without expecting recognition or even remembrance. I'd built decks where families would gather for birthday parties. I'd repaired porches where grandparents would sit with their grandchildren. I'd fixed leaky basements where teenagers would practice with their garage bands. Every nail you've driven, every board you've cut, every problem you've solved, he said, once again seeming to read my thoughts, has made someone's life a little better. That work doesn't disappear just because your business failed. But the business was everything I'd worked for. Was it? Or was it the vehicle you used to do what you were really called to do? We turned onto a wider street, and I could see the distant glow of downtown Chicago ahead of us. The city looked different now, not like a place where dreams went to die, but like a vast collection of individual lives, each one precious, each one interconnected in ways I'd never considered. "The foundation is still there, Marcus," he said quietly. "Everything else can be rebuilt." The passenger directed me through streets that seemed to shimmer with memory, each turn taking us deeper into parts of Chicago I thought I knew, but suddenly felt foreign and charged with meaning. The radio, which had been silent for the entire ride, suddenly crackled to life without my touching it. Static gave way to a song I hadn't heard in decades. "Amazing Grace," played on what sounded like an old church organ. My hands jerked on the steering wheel. I didn't turn that on. "Music has a way of finding us when we need it most," he said simply. The melody filled the car, and with it came a flood of memories I'd tried to bury. Sunday mornings at St. Patrick's on the south side, sitting between Mom and Dad in the fourth pew from the front, Dad's bass voice joining the hymn while Mom's soprano floated above it like a blessing. I'd been proud of how my parents' voices sounded together, how other parishioners would smile when they heard them. "You sang too once," the passenger observed. "I was 8 years old. Everyone thinks they can sing when they're 8. Father Mackenzie asked you to join the youth choir when you were 12. You said no because the other boys would make fun of you." Another memory I'd never shared with anyone. Father Mackenzie had approached me after Mass one Sunday, said I had a gift that shouldn't be wasted. But Tommy Kowalski and his friends had already started calling me names because I was good at school, and I couldn't risk giving them more ammunition. So I'd shaken my head and mumbled some excuse about being too busy with Little League. "Choices," the passenger said. "We make them for what seemed like good reasons at the time." "Turn here," he said, pointing to a narrow street I'd driven past 1,000 times but never explored. The street was lined with old brownstones, their facades weathered but dignified. Street lamps cast warm pools of light at regular intervals, and between them, shadows created intimate spaces where secrets might hide. As we drove slowly down the block, I noticed that several of the buildings had small plaques beside their front doors. "Historical district," I murmured. "This history is all around us, Marcus. Sometimes we just need the right perspective to see it." We stopped in front of a building that looked different from the others, newer but designed to fit seamlessly with its older neighbors. A sign in elegant script read, "Sullivan and Associates, Restoration Contractors." My heart stopped. That's my name. Look closer. I squinted at the building, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The sign was weathered but clearly maintained, and below the main name was smaller text, founded 1987, specializing in historical preservation. "This isn't real," I whispered. "What makes something real, Marcus? The fact that you can touch it, or the fact that it touches you?" I stared at the building, my mind reeling. The architecture was exactly the style I'd always dreamed of working on. The intricate brickwork, the ornate window frames, the careful attention to period details that required both skill and patience to restore properly. This was the kind of work I'd wanted to do when I first started my business, before market pressures and easy money from quick residential jobs had pulled me away from my true calling. "You specialized in historical restoration for the first 5 years," the passenger said. "I won 2 city awards for your work on the Fitzgerald Mansion and the old Riverside Theatre." I remembered those projects. They'd been labors of love, requiring research and craftsmanship that most contractors wouldn't attempt. The Fitzgerald Mansion had been a particular challenge. A 19th century estate that had been abandoned for years, its elaborate plasterwork cracked and stained, its hand-carved woodwork damaged by decades of neglect. Restoring it had taken 8 months and required me to learn techniques that hadn't been used in a century. "The city council gave you a plaque," he continued. "It said you'd preserved an irreplaceable piece of Chicago's heritage." The plaque was in a box in our basement, along with photographs of the mansion before and after restoration. I'd been so proud of that work, but it barely paid enough to keep the business afloat. When the housing boom started, I'd gradually shifted to new construction and remodeling, work that paid better but satisfied my soul less. "Why did you stop?" he asked. "You know why. Money. Sarah was pregnant with Emma, and we needed steady income. Historical restoration is feast or famine." "Was it, or did you lose faith in the value of what you were doing?" I thought about that. The truth was, I'd started to feel like historical restoration was self-indulgent, a luxury for rich homeowners who could afford to care about architectural heritage. New construction and kitchen remodels were honest work that regular people needed. I'd convinced myself I was being practical, responsible. "But you kept the books," he said. He was right. In my workshop at home, I had shelves full of books on architectural history, restoration techniques, traditional craftsmanship. I still bought new ones occasionally, telling myself they were just reference materials, but really because I couldn't let go of that part of myself completely. "The Riverside Theatre is playing tonight," the passenger said. "Would you like to see it?" Without waiting for my answer, he directed me to turn left, then right, then left again, through a maze of streets that seemed to rearrange themselves as we drove. The city around us grew quieter, the modern buildings giving way to older structures, until we emerged onto a wide boulevard I didn't recognize. There it was, the Riverside Theatre, exactly as I remembered it, but somehow more magnificent. The marquee blazed with warm light, and people were streaming out of the main doors, their faces animated with the afterglow of whatever performance they'd just witnessed. The building's facade gleamed in the light, every detail perfect, from the ornate carved faces above the windows to the intricate metalwork of the fire escapes. "Phantom of the Opera," the passenger read from the marquee. "Fitting, don't you think?" I pulled to the curb and stared at the building I'd helped restore 15 years ago. Every brick, every window, every decorative element had been carefully researched and authentically reproduced. The theatre company had wanted to modernize everything, but I'd convinced them that the building's character lay in its original details. Now it was one of Chicago's premier venues, hosting performances that drew audiences from across the Midwest. "Do you see that couple?" the passenger asked, pointing to an elderly man and woman walking slowly down the theater's front steps, arm in arm. The man was using a cane, and the woman stayed close beside him, matching his careful pace. They paused at the bottom of the steps, and she said something that made him laugh. He leaned down and kissed her forehead, and in that gesture I saw 50 years of marriage, of shared joys and weathered storms. "They've been coming here for 30 years, the passenger said. "Every anniversary. Tonight was their 60th. They almost didn't come this year because he's been sick." But she insisted. She said the theater was where he proposed to her during intermission of a production of Romeo and Juliet in 1963. I watched them walk slowly toward the street, still together, still choosing each other after all these years. The work I'd done on this building had created a space where love could be celebrated, where memories could be made and preserved. "How many couples do you think have gotten engaged in that lobby?" the passenger asked. "How many children have experienced their first live performance in those seats? How many hearts have been opened to beauty and wonder because you chose to preserve rather than replace?" I couldn't speak. The magnitude of it was overwhelming. Not just this building, but all the others, all the homes and businesses and sacred spaces I'd worked on over the years. I'd been thinking of my career as a series of individual jobs, but it was really a web of connections, a contribution to the fabric of the city and the lives of its people. "Oh, your father would be proud," the passenger said softly. The words hit me like a physical blow. Dad had died before he could see most of my major projects, but he'd lived long enough to see the Fitzgerald Mansion restoration. He'd taken the bus across the city to visit the job site, walking through room after room with wonder in his eyes. "You're not just building things," he'd told me that day. "You're keeping the past alive for the future." Now, sitting in front of the Riverside Theatre, I understood what he'd meant. Every building had a story, and every restoration was an act of faith. Faith that the past had value, that beauty mattered, that some things were worth saving even when it wasn't profitable to do so. "The foundation is still there," the passenger repeated, echoing his earlier words. "Everything else can be rebuilt." As we pulled away from the theater, I found myself thinking differently about my current situation. The business I'd lost had been focused on quick profits and easy jobs. Maybe its failure was an opportunity, a chance to return to the work that had originally called me to become a contractor. "There's something else you need to see," the passenger said, and I realized we'd been driving for 20 minutes without him giving me any directions. Somehow, I'd known exactly where to go. We were heading south now, toward a part of the city I hadn't visited in years. The streets grew narrower, the buildings older and more weathered. This was where I'd grown up, where my parents had struggled to make ends meet, where I'd learned that hard work and integrity were the only inheritance that really mattered. "Almost home," he said, and I knew he didn't mean my current house in the suburbs. He meant the place where I'd first learned who I was meant to be. The neighborhood of my childhood materialized around us like a photograph developing in slow motion. Here was Kowalski's Corner Market, still standing, but now painted bright yellow instead of the faded green I remembered. There was the fire station where the firefighters used to let us kids climb on the truck on summer afternoons. The playground where I'd learned to throw a curveball. The church steps where I'd kissed Mary Catherine Brennan after 8th grade graduation. "Turn here," the passenger said, though I was already turning, my hands moving the wheel as if guided by muscle memory older than conscious thought. We drove down Oakley Street, past houses that seemed smaller than they had in my memory, but somehow more solid, more permanent. Each one held fragments of my growing up. Mrs. Kowalski, teaching me how to make proper pierogi after Mom died. Mr. Jameson, letting me help him rebuild his porch steps. The afternoon I spent painting Mrs. Rodriguez's fence while she taught me basic Spanish through her kitchen window. "Stop here," the passenger said. I pulled to the curb in front of 2847 Oakley Street, the narrow two-story house where I'd lived until I was 18. The current owners had painted it a soft blue with white trim, but the structure was unchanged. The same narrow front porch where Dad used to sit reading the paper on Sunday mornings. The same steep stairs I'd raced up countless times. The same front window where Mom's face would appear, watching for me to come home from school. The house was dark except for a single light in what used to be the kitchen. I could almost smell Mom's pot roast, could almost hear Dad's hammer ringing from the basement workshop where he'd taught me to use tools, to measure twice and cut once, to respect the materials I worked with because someone had to cut down a tree or quarry a stone to make them available. "He's still here, you know," the passenger said. "Who?" "Your father. Not in the way you might think, but in every choice you make, every nail you drive, every problem you solve with your hands and your heart." I gripped the steering wheel harder, fighting against the tears that threatened to overflow. He'd be ashamed of me now. Everything he taught me about responsibility, about providing for your family, and I've failed at all of it. "Have you? Tell me about the morning he died." The memory hit me like a punch to the chest. Dad had been sick for months, but he'd hidden it well, the way men of his generation did. Cancer, the doctors finally said, too far along to fight. He died at home, in the bed he'd shared with Mom for 37 years, with Sarah and me sitting beside him. But he was worried about the Kowalski job, I said, my voice barely audible. Even at the end, he was worried about finishing it. Dad had taken on a small remodeling project for our old neighbor, even though he was already too weak to work. It was just a bathroom renovation, but Mrs. Kowalski was on a fixed income, and Dad had quoted her a price that barely covered materials. He'd planned to finish it himself, working a few hours each day when his energy was highest. "Dee, what did you do?" the passenger asked. I finished it for her, took 2 weeks of vacation from my own jobs, and did it exactly the way Dad would have done it. "And how did Mrs. Kowalski pay you?" I smiled, despite my tears. "She tried to pay me what she was going to pay Dad, but I told her it was already paid for." She cried, made me sit at her kitchen table and eat 3 servings of pierogi while she told me stories about how my parents had helped everyone in the neighborhood over the years. "Your father's last lesson," the passenger said, "not about carpentry or business, but about legacy. About what it means to live in a way that outlasts your physical presence." We sat in silence for several minutes, both of us looking at the house where I'd learned the fundamental truths that had guided my life, even when I'd lost sight of them. The light in the kitchen window flickered, and for just a moment, I could swear I saw a familiar silhouette moving across the glass. "He left you something," the passenger said. "I inherited his tools. They're in my workshop." "Not tools, something more important." I thought about the tools, carefully organized in their wooden cases, each one worn smooth by decades of use. I'd been using them for 20 years, but I'd never really thought about what they represented beyond their practical function. "His reputation," I said slowly. "His word, the way people trusted him because he'd never let them down. And that reputation died when your business failed." I considered the question honestly. In the months since the bankruptcy, I'd been so focused on my failure as a businessman that I'd forgotten about my identity as a craftsman. But the work itself, the actual building and fixing and creating, that hadn't changed. I was still the same person who'd learned to see beauty in straight lines and true angles, who found satisfaction in solving problems with my hands, who took pride in work that would outlast me. "Mrs. Chen," I said, remembering the small woman who was praying for me even now. She didn't care about my business. She cared about what I did for her. And there are others, hundreds of others, over 20 years. Families living in homes you've repaired, businesses operating in buildings you've renovated, children playing on playgrounds you've built. The scope of it was staggering. I'd been thinking about my career as a series of financial transactions, but it was really a web of human connections, a trail of problems solved and needs met, and small improvements made to people's daily lives. Your father's legacy isn't in the past, Marcus. It's in your hands, in your skills, in your character. The business was just a method of delivery. When one method fails, you find another. A new thought began to form, hesitant at first, but growing stronger. What if the failure of my business wasn't the end of my story, but the beginning of a different chapter? What if losing everything I thought I needed had freed me to rediscover what I was actually called to do? "There's one more stop," the passenger said. "Turn left at the next corner." We drove deeper into the old neighborhood, past the elementary school where I'd first learned about angles and measurements in geometry class, past the park where Dad had taught me to throw a baseball, past the barbershop where Mr. DeMarco had regaled 3 generations of local boys with stories of the old country while cutting their hair. Finally, we stopped in front of St. Patrick's Church, the massive stone building that had anchored the neighborhood for more than a century. Even in the darkness, its Gothic spires reached toward heaven like prayers made manifest in limestone and brick. The stained glass windows glowed softly from within, lit by the eternal flame that never went out. "It needs work," the passenger said. He was right. Even from the car, I could see that the building was showing its age. The mortar between stones needed repointing. Some of the window frames needed restoration, and the front steps had settled unevenly. It was the kind of work that required specialized knowledge and careful attention to historical authenticity. "Father Mackenzie has been trying to find someone who understands old buildings," the passenger continued, "and someone who can restore rather than simply repair. Someone who appreciates the craftsmanship that went into creating this place." I stared at the church, my mind already cataloging what needed to be done and how I would approach each challenge. This was the kind of project I dreamed of when I first went into business, work that mattered, that required all my skills, that would preserve something beautiful and meaningful for future generations. "The parish can't afford much," the passenger said. "Most of the work would have to be done for cost, maybe a little less. But it would be work that feeds the soul, not just the bank account." Through the car window, I could hear the faint sound of organ music. Someone was practicing, the melody floating through the stone walls and into the night air. It was the same hymn that had been playing on my radio, a dull, amazing grace, but played with such skill and reverence that it seemed to transform the very air around us. "Your foundation," the passenger said. "Your father's legacy, your true calling. It's all here, Marcus. It never left. You just stopped looking for it in the right places." As I sat there, looking at the church where I'd been baptized and confirmed, where I'd served as an altar boy and sung in the youth choir before fear silenced my voice, I felt something shift inside my chest. It was subtle at first, like the first crack in a dam, but then it grew stronger. Hope, I realized. For the first time in months, I was feeling actual hope. "I don't know if I can do it," I said. "Start over. I'm 64 years old." "Your father was 68 when he started his last major project," the passenger replied. "The restoration of the old Riverside Theatre. He said it was the most challenging work he'd ever done and the most rewarding." I turned to look at him directly for the first time, twisting in my seat to see his face clearly. But the back seat was empty. My heart hammered against my ribs. I looked in the rearview mirror, checked the side mirrors, even turned around completely to search the entire back seat. Nothing. No trace that anyone had been there at all. The radio was silent now, the display showing that it was turned off. But on the passenger seat beside me, there was something that hadn't been there before. A business card with elegant, embossed lettering, Sullivan and Associates, Historical Restoration, founded in faith, built to last. And below that, in handwriting I recognized as my own, but couldn't remember making, St. Patrick's Church, Preliminary Assessment. My hands shook as I picked up the business card, running my thumb over the raised letters. The cardstock was thick, expensive, the kind I'd always wanted but could never justify for my old business. How was it possible? I'd been alone in the car for less than 30 seconds, and there was no way anyone could have placed it there without my seeing them. I looked back at the church, half expecting to see someone watching from the shadows. but the building stood silent and serene in the wash of streetlight. The music had stopped, leaving only the distant hum of the city at night and my own rapid breathing. My phone buzzed, a text message from an unknown number. Faith requires first steps. Take yours. I stared at the screen until the words began to blur. This was impossible. All of it. The mysterious passenger, the business card, the text message. None of it could be explained by any rational understanding of how the world worked. But the card was real in my hand, solid and undeniable. I got out of the car, my legs unsteady, and walked toward the church entrance. The massive wooden doors, carved with intricate patterns that depicted the life of Christ, were locked as I'd expected. But beside them was a smaller door, the kind that led to the parish office, and it stood slightly ajar. "Hello," I called softly, pushing the door open. "Father Mackenzie?" The hallway beyond was lit by a single fixture, casting long shadows that seemed to dance as I moved forward. My footsteps echoed on the polished floor, each sound amplifying my sense of being watched by unseen eyes. Religious artwork lined the walls, paintings of saints I'd learned about in Sunday school, photographs of parish events spanning decades, children's drawings of biblical scenes that must have been recent additions to the collection. I found myself standing before a door marked Father Mackenzie, Pastor. Light seeped from beneath it, and I could hear the soft scratch of pen on paper. I knocked gently. "Come in, Marcus," came the familiar voice. Father Mackenzie looked up from his desk as I entered, his weathered face creasing into a smile that held no surprise at seeing me at 3 a.m. He was older than I remembered, his hair completely white now, but his eyes held the same warmth that had comforted me through childhood's scraped knees and adolescent spiritual crises. "Father, I began, then stopped. How could I possibly explain what had brought me here? "Sit down, son," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "I've been expecting you." Expecting me for about 3 hours now. Ever since I had the strangest urge to come to the church and pray for you specifically. Sometimes the Holy Spirit works in mysterious ways. He set down his pen and folded his hands. "You look troubled." The understatement almost made me laugh, but what came out instead was something between a sob and a sigh. "Father, I think I'm losing my mind. Tell me what happened." So I did. All of it, from the moment the mysterious passenger had entered my car until finding the business card on my seat. Father Mackenzie listened without interruption, his expression growing more thoughtful as the story progressed. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Show me the card," he said finally. I handed it to him, watching his face as he examined it. His eyebrows rose slightly as he read the text, and he turned it over to look at the blank back. "Sullivan and Associates," he murmured. "Historical restoration. I never had cards like that made. I don't even know where they would have come from." Father Mackenzie stood and walked to a file cabinet in the corner of his office. He withdrew a thick folder and returned to his desk, spreading its contents before me. Building assessments, contractor estimates, photographs of damaged stonework and deteriorating woodwork. "For 6 months, I've been trying to find someone to help restore this church," he said. It's not just maintenance anymore. We need someone who understands historical preservation, someone who can work with the Archdiocese's requirements for landmark buildings." He pulled out a sheet of paper covered with names, most of them crossed out. "Every contractor I've contacted either can't do the work or charges more than the parish could afford in 5 years. I was beginning to think we'd have to let the building deteriorate until it became unsafe. Father, last week, I had a dream," he continued, his voice taking on the cadence I remembered from his sermons. "I dreamed about your father, Marcus. He was standing in the sanctuary, looking up at the ceiling, and he said, 'My son knows how to fix this. He just needs to remember why he became a builder in the first place.'" The room seemed to tilt around me. "My father appeared in your dream." "Dreams," Visions, mysterious passengers who know impossible things. Does the method matter if the message is clear? Father Mackenzie smiled. I've been a priest for 43 years. Son, I've learned not to question how God chooses to communicate with us. He opened another file and showed me detailed architectural drawings of the church, dating from its construction in 1889. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Hand-carved stone details, custom millwork, stained glass windows that had been created by master artisans. It was exactly the kind of project I'd dreamed of working on when I first fell in love with historical restoration. The parish council meets tomorrow night, Father Mackenzie said. I'd like you to come, to tell them what you think needs to be done and how you would approach it. Father, I can't take on a project like this. My business is bankrupt. I don't even have insurance anymore, let alone a crew. What if those obstacles were removed? What if you could do the work as an independent contractor, with the parish providing insurance and helping you find skilled craftsmen who might be willing to work for less than their usual rates? I stared at the architectural drawings, my mind already seeing solutions to the problems visible in the photographs. The stone repointing would require careful matching of the original mortar composition. The window restoration would need someone who understood traditional glazing techniques. The wooden elements would have to be repaired using period-appropriate methods and materials. It would take months, I said, maybe longer. We've waited over a century for someone who could do it right. We can wait a bit longer. Father Mackenzie reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a small wooden box, worn smooth by decades of handling. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, was a silver medal I recognized. The St. Joseph medal my father had worn every day of his working life. He asked me to give this to you when the time was right, the priest said softly. He said someday you'd understand what it meant to build not just with your hands, but with your heart. I took the medal, its familiar weight settling into my palm like a homecoming. St. Joseph the Worker, patron saint of craftsmen and carpenters, the man who taught the Son of God the value of honest labor. Dad had worn this medal through every job, every challenge, every moment of doubt about whether his work mattered. He never told me he'd talk to you about this, I said. The day before he died, he called me to the hospital. He was worried about you, Marcus, not about your success. He never doubted you'd be successful. He was worried that you might forget why you became a builder in the first place, which was to serve, to use your gifts to make the world a little more beautiful, a little more stable, a little more like the kingdom of heaven. I fastened the chain around my neck, feeling the medal settle against my chest. Immediately, I felt different, not transformed, exactly, but reconnected to something I'd lost sight of. The weight of my financial problems didn't disappear, but it felt less crushing, more like a challenge to be overcome rather than a doom to be accepted. There's something else, Father Mackenzie said. He walked to the window and pointed toward the street. Look at your car. I moved to the window and looked down. My Honda Accord sat where I'd left it, but now there was another vehicle parked behind it. A white pickup truck with magnetic signs on the doors, reading Sullivan and Associates, Historical Restoration. In the truck bed, I could see the familiar shapes of toolboxes and equipment. That's impossible, I whispered. So was the burning bush, Father Mackenzie replied. So was water becoming wine. So was a dead man walking out of a tomb. Sometimes God works through natural processes we can understand, and sometimes he reminds us that understanding isn't always necessary for faith. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass of the window. The truck was real. I could see my reflection in its windshield, could read the phone number printed below the company name, but it was a phone number I'd never seen before, and the truck itself was newer and better equipped than anything I'd ever been able to afford. What am I supposed to do with all this? I asked. What your father would do, Father Mackenzie said. What you've always done. Take it one step at a time, one problem at a time, one day at a time. He placed his hand on my shoulder, the same gesture he'd used to comfort me as a child. Go home, Marcus. Talk to Sarah. Tell her the truth about everything, the business, the debts, the fear, and this night. Then come back tomorrow and let's see what we can build together. As I prepared to leave, Father Mackenzie handed me one more thing, a key ring with 2 keys. One for the church, he said, so you can come and go as needed. The other is for the truck. I believe you'll find all the paperwork in the glove compartment. I walked back through the darkened hallway, my footsteps sounding different now, more purposeful, more connected to the ground beneath my feet. The business card was still in my pocket. The medal was warm against my chest, and the keys felt solid and right in my hand. Outside, the white pickup truck waited in the streetlight, as real and impossible as everything else that had happened. I opened the driver's door and found the paperwork Father Mackenzie had mentioned. Registration, insurance, business license, all in my name, all properly filed and legal. On the seat was a leather-bound notebook, thick with pages of handwritten text. I opened it to the first page and saw my father's familiar handwriting. For Marcus, everything I wanted to teach you about building things that last. Use it when you're ready to remember who you really are. The rest of the notebook was filled with techniques, supplier contacts, project notes, and wisdom accumulated over 4 decades of craftsmanship. It was the inheritance I'd never known existed, the final gift from a man who'd understood that the most important tools couldn't be stored in a workshop. I sat in the truck for several minutes, feeling its presence around me like an embrace. Then I got into my Honda and drove home through the empty streets of Chicago, the white truck following in my rearview mirror like a promise made manifest, carrying me toward whatever came next. Dawn was breaking over the suburbs as I pulled into my driveway, the white pickup truck settling behind my Honda like it had always belonged there. The familiar sight of our house, the blue shutters Sarah had insisted on painting last spring, the rose bushes she'd planted along the front walk, the swing on the front porch where we'd spent countless evenings talking about our dreams, looked different now, charged with new possibility. I sat in my car for several minutes, trying to process everything that had happened. The business card was still in my pocket, the medal still warm against my chest, and the keys to the impossible truck still solid in my palm. In the growing light, none of it seemed less real, just more significant. The front door opened, and Sarah appeared on the porch, wrapping her bathrobe tightly against the morning chill. Even from a distance, I could see the worry etched in the lines around her eyes, the way her shoulders carried the weight of months of unspoken questions and careful silences. "Marcus?" she called softly. "Where have you been?" I got out of the car, my legs stiff from the long night, and walked toward her. For the first time in months, I looked directly into her eyes instead of finding reasons to glance away. "We need to talk," I said. She nodded, stepping aside to let me pass. The house smelled like coffee and the lavender soap she'd used for 20 years. In the kitchen, she poured 2 cups of coffee and sat across from me at the table where we'd shared thousands of meals, where we'd helped our kids with homework, where we'd planned our future back when the future seemed certain and manageable. "Sarah," I began, then stopped. "How do you begin to confess months of lies and financial ruin? How do you explain that the life your spouse thought she was living was built on borrowed time and borrowed money?" "I know," she said quietly. "What?" "I know about the second mortgage. I know about the maxed-out credit cards. I know about the business failing." She wrapped her hands around her coffee mug, seeking warmth. "I've known for weeks." The words hit me like cold water. "How?" "Bank statements, Marcus. Phone calls from creditors when you were out driving. I'm not stupid." Her voice carried no anger, just a deep weariness. "What I don't understand is why you thought you had to handle it alone." I stared at her, this woman I'd been married to for 37 years, who I thought I'd been protecting by keeping the truth from her. I was ashamed. I was supposed to provide for us, to keep us safe, and instead, I've destroyed everything we built together. "No," she said firmly. "You've destroyed our financial security. That's not the same thing as everything we built together. She reached across the table and took my hand, her fingers intertwining with mine in a gesture as familiar as breathing. Marcus, I didn't marry you for your business or your bank account. I married you because you were kind to my mother when everyone else thought she was difficult. I married you because you spent your Saturdays volunteering to build houses for families who couldn't afford contractors. I married you because you still cry during It's a Wonderful Life every Christmas. The tears I'd been holding back for months finally came, great heaving sobs that seemed to tear something loose in my chest. Sarah moved her chair around the table and held me while I cried, her hand stroking my hair the way she'd done when our children had nightmares. I'm sorry, I whispered against her shoulder. I'm so sorry I lied to you. I'm sorry too, she said. Sorry you felt like you couldn't trust me with the truth. Sorry you've been carrying this burden alone. We sat like that for a long time, holding each other in our kitchen as the sun climbed higher and painted everything in soft gold light. Finally, I pulled back and looked at her face, seeing past the worry lines to the girl I'd fallen in love with, the woman who'd chosen to build a life with me despite all my flaws and failings. There's more, I said. Tell me. So I did. Everything. The mysterious passenger, the impossible knowledge he'd possessed, the business card and the truck outside, Father Mackenzie and the church restoration project. I expected her to look at me like I'd lost my mind, but instead she listened with the same careful attention she'd given me when I told her about my dreams of starting my own business 40 years ago. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, looking out the kitchen window toward the driveway where the white truck sat gleaming in the morning sun. Show me the truck, she said. We walked outside together, and she examined the vehicle with the thorough attention she brought to everything important. She read the signs on the doors, looked through the windows at the tools and equipment, even walked around it completely as if checking for some flaw that would reveal it as an elaborate hoax. It's real, she said finally. I know it doesn't make sense, Marcus. She turned to face me, taking my hands in hers. Do you remember what you told me the night Emma was born? I thought back to that night 28 years ago, when our daughter had decided to arrive 3 weeks early during one of the worst snowstorms in Chicago history. We'd been trapped in the hospital for 2 days, just the three of us in a small room, watching snow pile up against the windows. You said God had a funny way of bringing the most important things into our lives when we least expected them. Sarah continued. You said sometimes miracles looked like accidents until you realized they were exactly what you needed, exactly when you needed them. You think this is a miracle? I think, she said, squeezing my hands, that you've been so focused on what you've lost that you've forgotten to look for what you might be gaining. She was right. For months, I'd been cataloging my failures, measuring myself against a standard that had more to do with financial success than personal worth. I'd forgotten that the most satisfying work I'd ever done had been the projects that paid the least but mattered the most. The church project, I said. Even if I could somehow make it work logistically, we'd still be facing bankruptcy. The house, the debts would all still be here whether you take the job or not. Sarah finished. Marcus, we're going to lose the house. We both know that. The question is whether we lose it while you're doing work that destroys your soul or while you're doing work that feeds it. She was right again. The financial reckoning was coming regardless of what I chose to do next. But I had a choice about who I wanted to be while it happened. What about you? I asked. Your job at the library barely covers groceries. If I take on a project that might take months to pay anything, then we'll figure it out, the way we always have. She smiled, and for the first time in weeks, it reached her eyes. Besides, I've been thinking about what comes next too. Mrs. Patterson asked me if I'd be interested in doing freelance research for her law firm. It pays better than the library, and I could work from home. It was as if the universe was rearranging itself around us, creating possibilities where none had existed before, or maybe the possibilities had always been there, waiting for us to be desperate enough or brave enough to see them. "There's something else," Sarah said. She walked back into the house and returned with a manila envelope. "This came yesterday. I was going to wait until you got home, but then you didn't come home, and She handed me the envelope, and I recognized the return address immediately. The City of Chicago, Department of Cultural Affairs. Inside was a letter on official letterhead. "Dear Mr. Sullivan, we are writing to inform you that the Riverside Theatre Foundation has recommended you for inclusion in our Historical Preservation Master Craftsman Registry. This designation recognizes contractors who have demonstrated exceptional skill in the restoration and preservation of historically significant buildings." The letter went on to detail the benefits of the designation: preferred status for city restoration projects, access to specialized training programs, connections to other master craftsmen working in historical preservation. It was recognition I'd never thought to seek, validation of skills I'd nearly forgotten I possessed. "They want to interview you next week," Sarah said, "for a documentary they're making about Chicago's architectural heritage." I read the letter twice, trying to absorb its implications. Someone, somewhere, had noticed the work I'd done years ago and thought it was worth celebrating. The foundation I'd thought was cracked beyond repair was actually solid, recognized, valued by people who understood what it meant to preserve beauty for future generations. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "The tools are ready. Your father would be proud." I showed the message to Sarah, who raised an eyebrow but didn't seem surprised. "Well," she said, "I guess you'd better go see what tools they're talking about." We walked to the white truck together, and I unlocked the toolbox in the back. Inside, organized with military precision, was a collection of tools I'd never seen but somehow recognized. Hand-forged chisels for stone carving, traditional woodworking planes made by craftsmen who'd learned their trade from masters, specialized instruments for measuring and marking that looked like they belonged in a museum but functioned with precision that modern tools couldn't match. At the bottom of the toolbox was a note in my father's handwriting. "These tools have been waiting for the right hands. Use them to build something that will outlast us both." Sarah picked up one of the chisels, testing its weight and balance. "These must be worth thousands of dollars." "They're worth more than that," I said, understanding somehow that their value had nothing to do with money. "They're an inheritance, a calling, a responsibility." We stood there in our driveway as the neighborhood came alive around us. Children walking to school, neighbors heading to jobs that paid regular salaries and offered predictable security. 6 months ago, I would have envied them. Now I felt something different. Not superiority, but a sense of purpose that had been missing from my life for too long. "So," Sarah said, closing the toolbox with a satisfying click, "when do you start?" "Tonight. Parish council meeting." I looked at her, this remarkable woman who'd chosen to believe in miracles and second chances. "Are you sure about this? About all of it?" She kissed me, soft and sure, the way she had on our wedding day, when the minister asked if she promised to love me for better or worse, for richer or poorer. "Marcus Sullivan," she said, "I've been waiting 37 years for you to remember who you really are. I'm not about to stop believing in you now." The parish council meeting was held in the church basement, in a room that smelled like coffee and old books, with fluorescent lights that flickered occasionally and folding chairs arranged in a circle. 7 people sat around a table covered with building assessments, contractor estimates, and photographs of the church's deteriorating condition. I recognized a few faces from my childhood. Mrs. O'Malley, who taught Sunday school for 30 years, Mr. Kowalski from the corner market, now retired but still sharp-eyed and decisive. Father Mackenzie introduced me simply. "Marcus Sullivan, son of Patrick Sullivan, who many of you remember. Marcus specializes in historical restoration, and he's here to talk about what our church needs. I spread the architectural drawings across the table, pointing to areas where problems were visible in the accompanying photographs. The stone foundations were solid, built to last centuries, but the mortar needed attention. The roof structure was sound, but some of the slate tiles required replacement. The real treasures were the interior elements: hand-carved wooden pews, ornate plasterwork, stained glass windows that had been created by master artisans in the 1890s. The question isn't whether this work needs to be done, I said. It's whether we do it right or settle for quick fixes that will need repeating in 5 years. Mrs. O'Malley leaned forward, studying the drawings. What would it cost to do it right? I'd spent the afternoon calculating materials and labor, factoring in the cost of specialized craftsmen and historically appropriate techniques. The number was substantial, but not impossible, if approached strategically over time with careful planning. About $60,000, I said, but not all at once. We could phase the work, starting with the most critical repairs and moving through the rest over 18 months. Mr. Kowalski whistled low. The parish budget is about $40,000 a year total. We can't afford a project like this. What if we could? I asked. I explained my research from the past week. The city's Historical Preservation Fund offered matching grants for restoration projects on landmark buildings. The state had similar programs, and there were private foundations that supported religious architecture preservation. With proper documentation and applications, we could potentially cover 60 to 70% of the project cost through grants. That still leaves us short, said Maria Santos, the parish treasurer. What if some of the labor was donated? I asked. What if we approach this as a community project, where skilled craftsmen donated time in exchange for the opportunity to work on something meaningful? The room was quiet for a moment. These were practical people who understood budgets and limitations, but they were also people of faith who understood that some things were worth stretching for, worth taking risks to preserve. Marcus, Father Mackenzie said, would you be willing to supervise this project, to coordinate the craftsmen, manage the restoration work, ensure it's done properly? Yes, I said without hesitation, but I need to be honest about my situation. My business failed. I'm filing for bankruptcy. I can't take on this project as a conventional contractor. What if the parish hired you as a project manager? Mrs. O'Malley suggested. A salary position, with the parish carrying the insurance and legal responsibilities. We spent the next hour working through details, finding creative solutions to practical problems. The parish could establish a restoration fund separate from the general budget. Local craftsmen could be recruited through the trade unions, many of whose members had attended this church or similar parishes. The work could be documented for the Historical Preservation Registry, creating a record that would benefit future restoration projects throughout the city. By the end of the meeting, we had a plan, not a complete plan, and not one without risks, but a framework for moving forward. The council voted unanimously to proceed with the preliminary phase, applying for grants, recruiting craftsmen, and beginning with the most urgent repairs. As people gathered their coats and said their goodbyes, Mr. Kowalski approached me. Your father would be proud, he said, echoing words I'd heard before. He always said you had the eye for quality work. Thank you, Mr. Kowalski. That means a lot. You know, he said, lowering his voice, I've got a nephew who works in stone restoration. Good kid, looking for projects where he can really showcase his skills. I'll give him your number. Mrs. O'Malley overheard. My son-in-law does traditional millwork. He might be interested too, and just like that, the network began forming. People who knew people. Craftsmen who were hungry for meaningful work, a community rallying around a shared vision of preservation and renewal. Father Mackenzie walked me to the parking lot where my white truck gleamed under the streetlights. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Scared," I admitted. "Excited, like I'm about to jump off a cliff and hope someone remembered to pack a parachute." That's what faith is, you know. Jumping off cliffs and trusting that what catches you will be stronger than what you left behind. Over the following days, momentum built in ways that felt both natural and miraculous. The grant applications I dreaded turned out to be straightforward, thanks to Sarah's research skills and her connections at the library. The city's Historical Preservation Office was enthusiastic about the project, offering technical support and expedited review processes. 3 craftsmen called by the end of the week: Mr. Kowalski's nephew Michael, who specialized in stone restoration; Mrs. O'Malley's son-in-law David, whose millwork had won awards; and a woman named Elena, who did traditional plasterwork and had been looking for a project that would challenge her skills. "We've all been wanting to work on something like this," Elena said when we met at the church to assess the interior restoration needs. "Jobs that pay the bills are fine, but this is work that feeds the soul." I understood exactly what she meant. Standing in the sanctuary, looking up at plasterwork that had been shaped by hand more than a century ago, I felt connected not just to the building, but to the craftsmen who had created it. We were part of a continuum, preserving their work so it could inspire future generations. The first grant approval came on a Tuesday morning, $15,000 from the Illinois Historical Preservation Fund, with the promise of additional funding if the project met specified milestones. I called Sarah from the church parking lot, barely able to contain my excitement. "It's really happening," I said. "Of course it is. Did you ever doubt it would? Every day, every hour, every minute. Well, stop doubting. You've got work to do." That afternoon, I climbed onto the church roof for the first time, assessing the slate tiles and underlying structure. The work was more extensive than I'd initially thought, but not overwhelming. With proper planning and the right team, we could restore this building to its original glory while ensuring it would last another century. As I worked, measuring and making notes, I found myself thinking about legacy again. My father had built things that lasted, but they were private homes and small commercial buildings, structures that served their immediate purpose but weren't necessarily meant to inspire. This church, though, this was different. This was a building that had hosted thousands of weddings, baptisms, funerals, and Sunday services. It was where people came to mark the most important moments of their lives, where they sought comfort in times of loss and celebrated in times of joy. Restoring it wasn't just about preserving architecture. It was about maintaining a sacred space, ensuring that future generations would have a place to gather, to worship, to find community in an increasingly fragmented world. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Every stone matters, every beam has purpose. Build something worthy of the prayers it will hold." I looked around the empty roof, half expecting to see someone watching me, but I was alone with the afternoon sun and the steady wind off Lake Michigan. The message could have been from any number of people: Father Mackenzie, one of the craftsmen, even Sarah. But somehow I knew it came from the same source as all the other impossible knowledge that had guided me back to this work. That evening, I spread the project plans across our dining room table, and Sarah helped me organize them into phases. Phase 1, emergency repairs and weather protection. Phase 2, structural restoration and major systems. Phase 3, decorative elements and final details. "How long do you think it will take?" she asked. 18 months, if everything goes perfectly. 2 years is more realistic. And after that, I looked at her. This woman who'd supported me through 40 years of dreams and disappointments, who'd believed in miracles when I'd lost faith in everything. "After that," I said, "we see what comes next. But whatever it is, we'll face it together with our eyes open and our foundations solid." She smiled and kissed my forehead, the way my mother used to do when I was small and uncertain about tomorrow. I love you, Marcus Sullivan. Even when you forget who you are, I never do. Outside, the white truck sat in our driveway like a promise kept, loaded with tools that connected me to generations of craftsmen ready for work that would outlast us both. Tomorrow, the real building would begin. 6 months later, I stood in the restored sanctuary of St. Patrick's Church, watching late afternoon sunlight stream through newly cleaned stained glass windows, painting the walls in jeweled patterns of red and gold and blue. The air smelled of fresh varnish and old incense, a combination that seemed to capture both the ancient purpose of this space and its renewed promise for the future. The work had been everything I'd hoped and more challenging than I'd anticipated. The stone restoration had revealed structural issues that required additional engineering support. The plasterwork had been damaged by decades of minor leaks, necessitating careful removal and reconstruction using traditional lime-based mortars. The stained glass windows had needed more extensive cleaning and releading than originally planned. But every challenge had also brought unexpected gifts. When we'd opened the walls to repair water damage, we discovered original decorative painting that had been covered over in the 1960s. Michael Bichir, the stonemason, had found a cornerstone inscription that dated the building's completion to 1891, 2 years earlier than anyone had realized. Elena's plasterwork had revealed skills she hadn't known she possessed, intricate molding and decorative elements that brought the ceiling to life. Marcus, Father Mackenzie's voice echoed in the quiet sanctuary. The documentary crew is here. The PBS team had been filming intermittently throughout the project, documenting both the technical restoration process and the human story of craftsmen rediscovering traditional skills. Today was their final interview, capturing the completed work and reflecting on what the project had meant to everyone involved. Sarah slipped into the pew beside me, her presence still capable of steadying my nerves after all these years. She'd become an integral part of the project, researching historical documentation, managing grant applications, and coordinating with the various craftsmen and suppliers. The work had drawn us closer together, creating a partnership that felt stronger than it had in years. "Ready for your close-up?" she asked. "As ready as I'll ever be." The interviewer, a woman named Catherine, who specialized in stories about historical preservation, set up her equipment near the altar. The lighting equipment created a warm glow that emphasized the restored beauty of the space. The rich wood of the pews, the intricate carving of the altar, the soaring lines of the vaulted ceiling. "Tell me about the moment you knew you had to take on this project," Catherine began. "I thought about that night 6 months ago, the mysterious passenger whose presence had changed everything, the impossible knowledge that had led me back to my true calling. How could I explain any of that to a television audience? I was driving late one night," I said finally, "and I realized I'd lost sight of why I became a builder in the first place. This project reminded me that some work is worth doing not because it's profitable, but because it preserves something beautiful for future generations." The project faced significant challenges. How did you overcome them? "Community," I said without hesitation. "Every problem we encountered, someone stepped forward with a solution. Craftsmen who donated time, parishioners who fundraised, city officials who expedited permits. It reminded me that no one builds anything meaningful alone." The interview continued for an hour, covering technical details and personal reflections. Catherine also interviewed Michael, Elena, David, and several parishioners who had supported the project. Each person spoke about how the work had affected them, how it had connected them to something larger than themselves. When the filming was complete, the crew packed their equipment and left us alone in the restored church. Evening was approaching, and the setting sun cast longer shadows through the windows, creating an atmosphere of profound peace. "Father Mackenzie," I said, "I have something for you." I handed him a leather portfolio containing complete documentation of the restoration, photographs, technical drawings, material specifications, and detailed notes about every aspect of the work. It was the kind of record that would be invaluable for future maintenance and any additional restoration needs. This is remarkable, Marcus. Thank you. There's more. I opened the portfolio to the final section, which contained letters from craftsmen across the country who had heard about the project and wanted to be involved in similar work. The church restoration had attracted attention from the historical preservation community, creating opportunities for future projects. The Riverside Theatre Foundation wants us to bid on restoring the old Carnegie Library downtown, I said. And there's a private collector in Wisconsin who needs someone to restore a Frank Lloyd Wright house that's been damaged by neglect. Father Mackenzie smiled. Sounds like Sullivan and Associates is back in business. It was true. The business had been reborn during the church project, built on a foundation of craftsmanship rather than profit, focused on work that mattered rather than work that merely paid well. We had a small but skilled team, a reputation for quality, and more projects than we could handle immediately. The financial situation had stabilized too, though not in ways I could have predicted. The bankruptcy had proceeded, allowing us to discharge the debts that had been crushing us. We'd lost the house, but we'd found a smaller place closer to the city, with a workshop where I could properly maintain the traditional tools that had become essential to my work. Sarah had thrived in her freelance research position, discovering skills and interests she hadn't known she possessed. Her work on the church project had led to consulting opportunities with other historical preservation projects, creating a partnership that complemented my hands-on restoration work. Our children had rallied around us in ways that surprised and moved us. Emma had helped design a website for the new business, and Tommy had used his marketing connections to help us reach potential clients. They'd been proud of our decision to start over, to choose meaningful work over financial security. As we prepared to leave the church, I walked through the sanctuary one more time, running my hand along the restored wooden pews, looking up at the ceiling where Elena's plasterwork caught the last light of day. 6 months ago, this space had been deteriorating, beautiful but fragile. Now it was renewed, ready to serve the community for decades to come. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Well done, good and faithful servant. Your father's legacy lives on. I showed the message to Sarah, who smiled and shook her head. Still getting mysterious messages? Less frequently, but they still come when I need them most. We walked outside together, where the white truck waited in the parking lot. It had become a familiar sight around the neighborhood, a symbol of work being done with integrity and skill. The tools in the back had been used daily, maintaining their edge and precision through constant use. As we drove home through the evening streets of Chicago, I reflected on everything that had changed since that impossible night 6 months ago. The mysterious passenger had never returned, at least not in any form I could recognize. But his influence continued in every choice I made, every project I accepted, every moment when I remembered that my work was about more than earning a living. Do you ever wonder if it really happened? Sarah asked, as if reading my thoughts. Which part? All of it. The passenger who knew impossible things. The business card that appeared from nowhere. The truck that materialized overnight. I thought about it honestly. The rational part of my mind still struggled with the impossibility of that night, but the evidence was undeniable. Not just the physical artifacts like the truck and tools, but the transformation in my life, the renewed sense of purpose, the work that fed my soul instead of merely paying my bills. I think, I said finally, that miracles don't always announce themselves with trumpets and angels. Sometimes they look like coincidences, like lucky breaks, like people appearing in your life exactly when you need them most. So you think it was a miracle? I think it was grace. However it happened, whoever made it possible, it brought me back to who I was meant to be. We pulled into our driveway. This smaller house that felt more like home than the mansion we'd lost ever had. The workshop light was on, because I'd been working on plans for the Carnegie Library project, measuring and calculating and dreaming about bringing another beautiful old building back to life. That night, as Sarah slept beside me, I lay awake thinking about foundations, not just the stone and concrete structures that hold up buildings, but the deeper foundations that hold up lives, faith, family, community, purpose. For too many years, I'd confused success with significance, profit with purpose. The failure of my business had felt like the end of the world, but it had really been the clearing away of everything that wasn't essential, leaving only what truly mattered. My father's medal lay warm against my chest, a reminder that the best work is done not for recognition or reward, but because it needs to be done. Because beauty and craftsmanship and careful attention to detail are their own rewards. Tomorrow there would be more work, more challenges, more opportunities to build things that would outlast me. But tonight I was content to lie in the darkness, grateful for second chances and mysterious passengers and the infinite grace that catches us when we finally learn to fall. Through the bedroom window, I could see the white truck in our driveway, ready for whatever came next. And in the distance, barely visible in the city lights, the spires of St. Patrick's Church reached toward heaven like prayers made manifest in stone and glass, and the patient work of human hands. The foundation was solid. Everything else could be built upon it, one stone at a time, one day at a time, one act of faith at a time. Dear listeners, we hope Marcus Sullivan's story touched your heart. If you'd like to keep experiencing powerful stories like this, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and tell us in the comments which part moved you the most. Every day, we share stories that reveal the depth of life and the human heart. We'll be waiting for you in the comments.